And thank you more for your sacrificial giving. And that's point number 2. Moms don't just model courageous faith, they also show us how to give sacrificially. So Mary, Elizabeth, and Anna, they're well-known characters in Luke's first 2 chapters. But as you read through Luke's gospel, there are so many other stories of women who step out in faith and are used by God. However, for this point, I want to jump ahead to a section we haven't covered yet, Luke chapter 21, the first part. When we get there, we're not going to have time to cover this passage in depth, so let me give it some attention today. This is the story of the widow's mite, which consists or contrasts a section right before in chapter 20. Because there, Jesus is confronting, as he usually does, the scribes and their attention-seeking motivations. These scribes, these seemingly religious people, are a big show, Jesus says. And then he contrasts them with a poor woman who shows us how to give. We read this in Luke 21:1. It says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. So picture this scene right here. Jesus has a crowd around him. He's teaching them about the hypocrisy of the scribes. And he says those are the people that walk around acting holy. They're so self-righteous. You got to beware of them. And as he's teaching, he looks up and he sees a perfect illustration right in front of him. A poor widow putting in what seems like a little bit of money, and he compares her to the rich counterparts. Now, widows in the ancient world, if you don't know, were very poor. You could identify them by their dress. So he looks up and it's obvious her stature. And she gives these 2 small coins, perhaps equivalent to today, her putting in 2 pennies. And the reason for this specific gift doesn't really make a big difference, but Jesus is making this observation in verse 3. He says, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them," all the rich folks. Now, that would have been a pretty shocking statement. How could these 2 small coins possibly have been worth more than what the rich people put in? It would be like somebody tithing $20,000 a month compared to somebody putting in $2. Less zeros behind the 2. How could she possibly have put in more than them? Well, Jesus explains in verse 4. He says, "For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Wow. Now that's an important piece of the story. Giving all she had to live on. Because these 2 pennies might not have been very much, but it was all she had. And the New Testament does this often with giving. It encourages people to give extravagantly and not settle for a small portion of their income. Even though the rich gave a lot more, it was a small percentage of their worth. And then to further drive the point home, because the widow gave all she had, now she has nothing left, and she would actually have a beggar's status. So what does the story teach us? Why does Jesus use this as an illustration? If you look back at verse 3, Jesus uses the phrase, "Truly I tell you," and I want you to circle that. Because every time Jesus uses that phrase in Luke, it introduces an example of discipleship. Luke 9:27, before Jesus tells us to take up our cross and follow him, he uses that phrase. Luke 12:44, Jesus uses those words to introduce a call to be ready for the master's return. And here, Jesus is saying that the widow, this poor widow, whom no one respects or pays attention to, her sacrificial giving shows what it means to be my disciple. The widow shows us how to give sacrificially. And sacrificial giving is part of discipleship. And that's where moms, I think, are instructive for us. Because so many mothers know how to give sacrificially for their kids and their family. In fact, almost every mother will tell you their work is never done. There's always a kid crying. As much as you don't want to worry about your kids when they get older, you do. As exhausted as you are and you want to nap, you still give. Mothers give sacrificially of their sleep, their money and convenience, their goals for themselves, their me time. Also, others can be blessed. If you're a young mom here today, you may be walking especially through that season. Today, it may feel like nobody notices your sacrifice. And you need to hear this. Jesus took notice of this widow, and he commended her. And Jesus sees you. He loves you. He's walking with you. Thank you for your sacrifice. So the widow in Luke offers a lesson and a challenge. And I want to ask two questions. Number one, why do we give sacrificially? Well, it doesn't exactly say why she gave all she had, but if she was an example of a disciple, her heart likely broke for something, because a broken heart moves us to give. It's compassion. That's the motivation many people have in giving. There's a cause you want to support, like First Choice Women's Resource Center. There's someone in need you want to help. The reason a mother sacrifices is that her heart is broken for her children. You can't stand to hear your child cry. You want to make sure your children are cared for. You want them to thrive, and you'll do everything you can to help, even as they get older. Secondly, how does sacrificial giving grow us? Well, the reason God calls us to give sacrificially is that he wants us to learn dependence on him. God is our provider and sustainer. And to learn that, we have to exercise, many times, outsized faith in giving. Sometimes we're called to give when it doesn't make human sense. Sometimes we're called to give when it's uncomfortable and doesn't benefit us. Faith doesn't always align with human sensibilities. And this point I'm making is often a tension you find between moms and dads. Because let's say a need arises, and dad often is the one who goes and checks the bank account and says, we don't have enough money. And then mom makes her case for the need and says, it doesn't matter, we have to help. So just to be honest, moms are often better at sensing the needs than others, because they trust that God will provide. And so, Mom,